here, which is a great pleasure, as I said, and Professor David Gellner, the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropologies. I'm always sort of wondering about the social and cultural houses, sort of about the sequence of the two, and social and cultural anthropology, and has been doing a lot of research, mostly in Nepal, Kathmandu Valley, other parts of South Asia, East Asia, probably even in Japan, on mostly issues of religion, Buddhism, Hinduism, with a focus on ritual, on healing, on symbolism, but also in more recent works on ethnicity, politics, and of course on activism. And just having a look, very brief look, and I'm not going to read all the publications, but because it's really sort of, it's a long list, so just sort of picking out some of the publications, just to give you an impression on the work of David Gellner. It's one of the latest monographs is from 2005. It's called Rebuilding Buddhism in Harvard University Press. There's another book published 2001, The Anthropology of Buddhism and Hinduism, Oxford University Press. And then there's a huge series of edited volumes which have become widely read and received, like Varieties of Activist Experience, one of the reasons why Wizard Lab Day is around today and tomorrow. Ethnic Activity, Activism and Civil Society in South Asia is another one. And for those who sort of want to have an impression on the kind of on the variety of issues which have been dealt with in this work, is another edited volume which has become widely received, is Inside Organizations, Anthropologists' Work in 2001, which is one of those quite early books in that regard. So, David, welcome, and we look very much looking forward to your paper. And if you're starting to suffocate, then just tell us, and then I'm going to just jack it off, and we'll do our best to change the situation.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Sorry, I'm not capable of giving this in German, which somehow I feel I ought to be able to do. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you very much, because, as you said, activism is something I had a sort of 3-year project on it a long time ago now, and some of that was drawn on here. I've also more recently worked on diaspora populations in the UK, which is absolutely buzzing with activism of various sorts, and you can learn something about activism in the home country from what happens when people try to reconstruct their organizations, their culture, their life in diaspora. But I'm not going to talk about diaspora today. This is the plan of the lecture. I'm going to make quite a lot of remarks, some favourable, some unfavourable, about Bruno Latour and active network theory. If you're not at all interested in that, I apologise. But I hope there'll still nonetheless be enough in here that even if you're not interested in that, that it might be interesting for you. But let me say it right up front why I'm doing that. Partly it's because, well, partly it's just because you can't go on and bang on about Max Weber and Louis Dumont all the time. You have to try and catch up with your students at some point, and also because it's been, even if the theory hasn't been so influential, the language, the terminology has become incredibly influential. So I thought, why not? So let's try and do an accounting and see whether it helps us or not. So this is the structure of the talk. So I shall talk some about, make some remarks, and I'm going to also make some remarks about neo-hacking. Then I'll get deep into the stuff which is, if you like, my bread and butter, which is ethnicity and nationalism. Then I'll have a brief, come back to those briefly. Then I'll have a long case study, which is a friend of mine, Richard Manchakya. I'm going to talk about his life and work as an activist. Because he's the one who inspired me to initially to take up the study of activism in the Nepali case, and then I'll come to a conclusion. So I'm going to read this out. I assume that you can all read. The history of social anthropology in the 20th century could be written in terms of the initial adoption of, and then the gradual rejection and deconstruction of Durkheim's legacy. Step by step, anthropological theory has dismantled and discarded the concepts of society and culture, social and cultural, that are used to name our discipline. It has replaced them with more individualistic, fluid and ad hoc concepts. So generalising grossly, social anthropology has retreated from comparative and generalising frameworks. that brilliant gadfly and playful philosopher Bruno Latour may be taken as emblematic. He sets out quite deliberately to expunge the last remnants of Durkheimian thinking from the social sciences. His theory, actor network theory, sets out to erase references to the social and to demolish the idea that there is a separate or distinctive social sphere that is the preserve of social scientists. In its place, he posits networks of things, artifacts, people, hybrid entities, all of which have agency, and therefore all of which are actants. Latour has always championed Tarde against Durkheim. Durkheim is very clearly the #1 target of his tirades against the social. There have been some strikingly Latourian analyses of activist events. I think particularly of Annelies Ryle's book, The Network Inside Out, on the Beijing Conference of 1995. My reaction is that in all the talk of distributed agency, assemblages, the attention to materiality and the agency of things, along with the doubtless well-meant attempt to rescue objects from the condescension of history, it seems to me that the achievements of particular named individuals have got lost. And I think sometimes dedicated individuals do actually make a difference. For example, there is one very small ethnic group in Nepal, the Chantyal, who have been more or less single-handedly conjured into existence in the modern period by one man, Dil Bahadur Chantyal. Latour titled his book, "We Have Never Been Modern," and he demonstrated a deep understanding of what it is that we had never been. He provided a sharp picture of what he calls the constitution of modernity, which according to him we can imagine but never achieve or enact. And it's true, anthropologists have been very sceptical about modernity and have rightly criticised so-called development specialists and others who think they know exactly what it is and how to bring it about. The history of development efforts moving from infrastructure to education to social capital and empowerment and finally settling for poverty alleviation and capacity building is well known. The mistake was to assume that modernity is a thing or a fixed set of traits, rather than a relationship, a process, or a set of performative discourses. But once one has accepted that modernity does exist as an idea and as an aspiration, then the way is open to study it comparatively. One trend that surely is universal is the reworking of local notions in terms of the idea of modernity, i.e. the process of deciding which traditions can be maintained in the modern world and which must be reformed or abandoned. And that reconstruction is now underway, or has been underway for quite a long time, pretty much everywhere. And the modernist idea is still seductive, even in those places where it is oldest. Witness, for example, the attractiveness of new labour, or modernised labour in its time, obviously not now. In other parts of the world, that this modernisation is obviously very much a work in progress. In late 20th century, neoliberal ideas of the appropriate role and extent of the market and the state, spread and imposed by the institutions of global economic governance, are an important part of this, but they're by no means the whole story, which is both older and deeper. Obviously, older terms being progress or improvement. So this paper is about those people and institutions that aspire to bring some version of modernity to Nepal. They are mediators, they are brokers, they are translators between Western and or global ideas on the one side and local understandings of them on the other. They mediate between state and society and also between political ambitions and local realities. And of course, it's not only local practices that must be adapted to modernity, obviously has to go the other way around, and the process that's been named vernacularization by Levitt and Merry, among others. So Nepal is arguably a very interesting case study for looking at these kinds of things, because it's, the modernization has happened in such a short period. So changes that took 150 years in India and even longer in Europe have been compressed in Nepal into just 50 years in the second half of the 20th century. Within the span of a single lifetime, Nepal has moved from a deeply hierarchical society where caste is utterly taken for granted, hierarchy is utterly taken for granted and supported by custom, law and the state, to a society in which the invocation of universal human rights is pervasive, where a Maoist revolution has happened and then been domesticated, where a hereditary Hindu monarchy has been abolished, and the third gender has appeared on official forms long before it does so in Europe. I'm also going to focus, one of my key examples is the emergence, the reimagination of the nation, of Nepal as a nation, and made up of what I call, this is kind of ugly term for which I apologise, macro categories, which are kind of larger than actual ethnic groups, these kind of 4 or 5 macro categories in terms of which the nation is imagined. Okay, so before I get to that, let me just briefly say something about Ian Hackey, who's very interestingly written about what he calls making up people. And what he's interested in is how new types of personal identity, he's particularly interested in the kind of medical examples, medical syndromes. And he gives us these 2 propositions for the reader's consideration. A, there were no multiple personalities in 1955, and there were many in 1985. B, in 1955, having a multiple personality was not a way to be a person, but by 1985 it was a way to be a person. And of course, what was then called multiple personalities is now called dissociative identity disorder. Now, Hackey believes that both proposition A and proposition B are true. But if he suggests that if you substitute high-functioning autists, so somebody with high-functioning autism for multiple personalities in these 2 statements, B remains true, but A becomes false. So in other words, what he's saying is that it depends on the syndrome. You have to actually look empirically. You can't argue deductively like a philosopher and say these propositions are true of all medical syndromes. What he's claiming is that it depends on the syndrome. Some syndromes exist even when there's no name for them. Other syndromes only come into existence when there's a name for them. That's what he claims. And he then proceeds to identify, when this happens, when the names are created, he identifies 10 different processes that then start to happen in chronological order. Starting with counting. Once you've named it, you can count it, and you can quantify it, and you can create norms and so on, and you can bureaucratize it, you can geneticize it, you can normalize it. Finally, at the very end, you can claim it, you can set up an organization for the rights of and the inclusion of the people who have that identity. Now, clearly I am not saying that ethnic identities are the same as medical diagnoses, okay? But nonetheless there are some parallels between the ways that they emerge and become normalized. Okay? Not all 10 processes happen with ethnic identities, but many of them do, and I'm going to give you some examples in a minute. And the politics of Nepal, since the revolution of 1990, have been very largely about the incorporation, the naming, and incorporation into the state, in other words, the normalizing and bureaucratizing of new kinds of ethnic identity. And on top of that, certainly the creation of what I call macro categories, which are these larger groupings of ethnic groups. These have come into existence since 1990, and they have become the basis for political action. And they have acquired a kind of existential reality that is threatened when somebody proposes to change the provincial boundaries of the new federal, supposedly federal state of Nepal, which the new constitution was finally passed in, but very controversially, in September 2015, and still being argued about, and the boundaries are still, the different provinces are still contentious, and people are willing to fight and die for those boundaries. And no one knows how those conflicts are going to end and be resolved, or if they will be resolved. Okay, so a little bit of history. This next section is called Nepal as Empire. So Nepal, as it is today, is very largely the creation of one man. Okay. So again, going to my great man theory of history. And his name is Prithvinarayan Shah. That's obviously not, it's a painting of him, but not from his own time, of course. It's how he was imagined in later times. And he ruled initially over the tiny kingdom of Gorkha, about 50 kilometers to the northwest of Kathmandu. And that little town of Gorkha gives us the name Gurkha, which is what soldiers, Nepalese soldiers fighting for the British, or occasionally in the Singapore are known as. And from 1743, when he ascended the throne, until his death in 1775, he fought continuously and against the odds to create his new kingdom. And he conquered this great swathe, which is now Nepal, and actually beyond his descendants actually conquered territory that went beyond, but was then chopped off by the British. He used to be widely lauded as Prithvinarayan Shah the Great, and it's seen by, was seen and still is seen by many as the father and founder of the nation. But he's become a controversial figure. The index finger on the statue outside Singha Darbar, which is the kind of where the main government offices, central government offices are, was deliberately broken in protests in 2006, because this figure is supposed to be symbolising the unity of the nation. Many other statues of Prithvinarayan have been removed. So in Pokhara, the second city of Nepal, his statue has been replaced by a statue of Lakhan Thapa, who's a culture hero of the Magar ethnic group. Although, of course, and this will be familiar to many people who are used to, in Europe, who are used to squares and streets being renamed every time there's a new regime. So the roundabout with the statue of Lakhan Thapa is still called Prithvi Chowk, even though, if you say Lakhan Chowk, most people don't know what you're talking about. Those people who wish to honour Prithvinarayan are often reduced to bringing out cardboard cutouts, as in this picture on the annual day in January that celebrates his achievement, or not, as the case may be. And views have become more and more polarised, with one part of the country seeing him as the unifier and creator of modern Nepal, and believing it a matter of national shame that his day is no longer observed as a national holiday, while others see him as an imperialist, a killer and the enslaver of the ethnic groups of Nepal. Richard Burkhardt wrote a seminal article about the development of Nepal as a nation-state. Following the great Nepali economic historian M.C. Redby, Burkhardt stressed that in the late 18th and 19th century, the Shah kings, that's to say Prithvinarayan and his immediate successors, thought of their possessions as they were the master of those possessions, and the possessions belonged to them. But they didn't think in a nationalist kind of way, and certain regions were thought of as belonging to certain people and certain cultures. It wasn't necessary that that such regions belonged inside the territory of one king. They could belong half to one and half to another. There was no problem with that. And yet, at the same time, within the kingdom of the Shah kings, some people belonged more than others. So when villagers in the far west complained about taxes, they were punished. When villagers from closer to the heartland of the country complained, their complaints were listened to and they were given more consideration. So there was definitely a hierarchy of belonging even then, and that's fed into a feeling in the modern times, of course, that some people are much more excluded than others, which I shall come to. So the perception of the Nepali state as favouring some groups over others has led to a radical re-evaluation. The historian Kumar Pradhan has initiated this revisionist trend, and he argued that it was quite anachronistic to claim, as some Nepali historians had, that Prithvinarayan Shahs was similar to Italian or German unification. And he said this is completely anachronistic, a kind of hindsight view. There was no cultural unity before that. That's the argument of Kumar Pradhan, which has, as you will see, some echoes today. All right, so this next section is called Nepal as a nation-state, the emergence of ethnic groups and macro categories. So the Shah kings period is kind of interlocked with the Rana period. The Ranas were hereditary prime ministers from 1845 to 1951, who basically shut the kings up in their palaces and treated them as prisoners, but at the same time intermarried with them. They married all their children to the children of the Shah kings, so that the Ranas and the Shahs are now kind of deeply interrelated many times over. And the Ranas instituted, Jung Bahadur Rana, the first of the Rana prime ministers, introduced a legal framework that legitimated caste hierarchy and a Hindu polity. And this then, in 1951, this Rana regime fell, and you had sort of the king came back, and that's why it was because the kings were imprisoned by the Ranas that in the Panchayat period from 1960 to 1990, the Shah kings were able to present themselves as the bringers of democracy. This particular history of Nepal meant that at that time the kings could present themselves as democratic, as bringing development, and as guaranteeing national unity. So they could wrap up this panchayat ideology, which was when political parties were banned for 30 years. It may seem ridiculous now, but at the time you could have this package of monarchism, developmentalism, nationalism, and democracy, and then it sort of made sense to people, at least to enough people, to survive for 30 years. That panchayat period was a period of nation building, and it was the period when the school system was rolled out. It's the period of homogenization. It's a period when the Nepali language was imposed and made the single official language. And there was this report actually comes, this quotation is from a report from the 1950s, which a British educationalist had a lot of input into. It's now mainly quoted by ethnic activists today to show how anti-multicultural the period was, that it deliberately set out to try and kill off deliberately set out to kill off the local languages, the ethnic languages of Nepal. So if the period from 1960 to 1990 was the period of nation building par excellence, the 17 years since 1990, this is written whenever it was, 2007, so anyway, the years since 1990 have been the period of ethnicity building par excellence. And a key part of that process of creating new ethnic identities has been to perform in everyday life. And so one way of doing this is that every ethnic group now has its own greeting. So whereas before 1990, Namaste or Namaskar had become the standard way of greeting people, of course there's a history for these greetings. After 1990, different ethnic groups started either reviving or, in most cases, inventing a new greeting which would be specifically for them. So Jozopa for Mewas, Sebaro for Limbus, Piafura for Tamangs, and so on. And at the same time, the activists of each ethnic group created and began to hold big annual ceremonies, and usually on their own public holidays. And specifically, the idea was that every ethnic group should have its own New Year celebration. So ideally, each ethnic group is supposed to have its own, not only its own name and its own language with its distinct greeting, but also each ethnic group is supposed to have its own script, its own cultural practices, its own history, its own New Year festival, its own distinctive dress, its own anthem, and its own territory. So in other words, every group is identical in the way that it is different from each other. Okay? So they're all peas in a pod in one way. The ways in which they're different are identical, even if the difference, everyone is supposed to be different from each other. Where these features do not exist historically, they have to be invented. As David Homburger said, if ritual is indeed about social production, a new order has emerged in Nepal ritually before it has emerged constitutionally. Of course, these ritual practices and symbols are not invented out of thin air. They draw on pre-existing ties, rituals and memories. But what is going on is a lot more than just expressing a pre-existing solidarity. There can be no doubt that a new encompassing unit is being created through these practices. And in some cases, in cases of some groups, for example the Rai or Gurung cases, inherited divisions within the group are quite sharp, and there's quite a lot of friction. And the attempts to deny those previously existing differences or to supersede them causes yet more friction. Not only do each group have its own New Year, as I mentioned, but there's somehow this idea has gone hold that each group has to have its own script, and that's gone furthest beyond the borders of Nepal in the Indian state of Sikkim. There, the national newspaper of Sikkim is published simultaneously in 13 different languages, in 13 different scripts. Schneiderman and Turin have called this obsession with developing a distinctive script, scriptophilia, and they note the irony of having distinctive written sources being seen as a key symbolic marker among what are officially tribal populations who in other contexts are defined in terms of their distinctively oral traditions. So that's at the level of ethnic groups. And as I say, above that, there is a completely new set of terminology that has started to emerge for what I call macro groups. Okay, sorry, I should have. Okay, so here are the names of some of these macro categories. the kind of actual terms in current use on the left in green, and then the kind of older terms which they're reflecting or building upon in the columns to the right. So this terminology, this fivefold terminology for dividing up the country, as I say, is completely new. One of the advantages of doing long-term field work and going back again and again is that you actually can plot these changes. So I can affirm categorically that when I was doing my original PhD fieldwork in the early 1980s, these terms did not exist and would not have been recognised. So 4 major macro categories have emerged, and it's not the order in which they've emerged is not by chance and not a coincidence. So the first to emerge was Janajati. Now Janajati is a neologism borrowed from Hindi, possibly also coming in by influence of Bengali, and it's the name for those that would have in the past been known as hill tribes, or in Nepali as Matwali, that's to say as alcohol drinkers, although it also includes Tarus from the Terai Plains belt. And the Newars are also classified as officially as Janajati by the government, but this is controversial. The Madeshis, the second term which emerged was Dalit. And again, this is an old term, but it's new for Nepal. It was not, I can categorically, it was not used in Nepal in the 1980s. It came in, might have been 1 or 2 people might have used it, but it was not in wide recognition or wide use in the 1980s. It came in after 1990. And Dalit is the new politically correct way of referring to what used to be called untouchables. And they have got a quite distinctive situation, of course, because they don't have a territory and their socio identity as the stigma is part of it, and being disadvantaged is part of it. So that puts them in a somewhat different situation from other ethnic groups. The third term to emerge was Madheshi, which literally means someone from the Madhya Desh, or the middle country. It's an ethnic term for those people of Nepali citizenship who are culturally and linguistically identical to people on the other side of the Indian border. Kind of a long way around of saying it, defining it. So they're ethnically and culturally and linguistically Indians, if you like, but they are Nepali citizens, and many of them have been for many generations. But of course, the fact that they are identical to Indians across the border is what makes their situation particularly problematic. Finally, the last of the 4 big ones to emerge is Khas Arya. And of course, it's not a coincidence that the dominant group, the ethnic term for the dominant group, should emerge last. And very roughly speaking, Madheshi is the most fluid and the most controversial, but depending on who you include, if you have a kind of semi-maximal definition of Madheshi, then the top 3 categories, Khas Arya, Janajati and Madheshi, are roughly a third each, or 30% each. So it's a kind of, if you like, it's a classic recipe for instability. I mean, at least it's not the Sri Lankan situation of 70%, 30%, which is a recipe for civil war, but it's still a recipe for radical instability, and that indeed, radical political instability is indeed what Nepal has experienced since 1990. So this is the unofficial hierarchy of belonging. Okay? So you've got the Khas Arya, that's mainly the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, or Bauns and Kshatriyas as they're called in Nepal. The Newars are a kind of anomalous group because they are perceived by others, because they remain concentrated in Kathmandu, in the capital, and they're HDI, if you look at the Human Development Index, they're come top, but they're officially classified as Janajati, so they're both central and excluded, and they themselves are internally very divided, and so on. So it's complex. Social anthropologists are familiar, at least since Diana Forsyth's analysis of German identity, that what looks from the outside like a singular national identity, what is supposed to be a nation of equal citizens, is in practice and in the way people experience it, a hierarchy. So certain people, I mean, I don't need to get this in front of this audience, certain people are considered more German than others. Those from Old West Germany being more German than Aussies, and both of these being more German than the descendants of Germans from Eastern Europe. As any more German than me, I just have a German surname. So there's a level, at the level of everyday interaction and unthinking assumption, there are gradations of Germanness. And of course this goes for all other national identities as well. Some belong more than others. Another way of putting this is to say that national identities usually have an ethnic core. The story is more complicated obviously with settler societies, but the same rule can be made. So generations of anthropology students have been introduced to this fact about identity, namely that it is a digital distinction imposed on an analogue reality through Thomas Hyland Ericsson's textbook on ethnicity and nationalism. So this is my adaptation of this idea and this model to the Nepali case. So I've mentioned the Kasaris who are in the centre, then we've got the Jamajatis, the hill, mainly hill, what used to be called hill tribes. But there's a dotted line so that some Jamajatis are more central than others. So the Gurus and others would be more closer to the core, if you like, than say Tarus and the Tarai. Then outside them you've got the Dalits, the Untouchables, and then right beyond that you've got the Bhutias, that's to say the people of Tibetan culture along the northern fringe, and the Madeshis, the people of Indian culture along the southern fringe. Some Madeshis, led by C.K. Raut, believe they will never be accepted as Nepalis. He was emotionally converted to this view in December 2000 when there were riots. A famous Bollywood film star called Hrithik Roshan was quite incorrectly rumoured to have made anti-Nepali remarks. That sparked off riots in Kathmandu. In those riots, Madeshis were targeted, and C.K. Raut decided that there was no way he would ever be accepted properly as a Nepali. The Madesh, that is to say the Terai, the southern strip of Gangetic Plain of Nepal, needed to secede and become a separate country. So he has started a movement, a explicitly non-violent movement. He's been arrested several times. He was just arrested again about 10 days ago, over 2 weeks ago. He's basically being harassed by the Nepali state for advocating secession. Now, this hierarchy of belonging, I emphasize, is unofficial. So I think we need to distinguish at least three contexts. There's the formal and legal context in which all Nepalis are officially legally equal, okay? And that has been the case since the new law code of 1964. Then there's the context of reparation for caste injustices. Nepal now, like India, has a system of what they call reservations, and the way it's actually working out is differs, but anyway, from India slightly, and it hasn't got the same deep history as in India, but it is there. And then finally, there's the backstage or unofficial context in which some people belong more than others. And this is, part of the reason for this, of course, is to do with the history, the fact that Baun and Chetri models have dominated the development of the state. It is their language, it is their dress, which is the national dress, and so on. And, of course, with the rise, since the period since 1990 has been the period of ethnicity building, and when reservations were built to the electoral system, that was the key point in 2008. In 2008, we had two sets of elections now with a mixed electoral system in 2008 and 2013. And those electoral systems, in that electoral system, there are 240 first past the post MPs, but the rest of the MPs, the other 361, are elected by, well, there's 25 who are appointed, but put those aside, the rest are proportional, and is proportional in accordance to your percentage of the population. So that's when that started to happen. Suddenly the Baun Chetris woke up. They hadn't taken the ethnicity issue seriously until 2008. After that they suddenly did, and there's been a whole movement of dominant ethnicity. And the custom, and Chetri the Brahmin Bauns and the Chetris have formed their own ethnic groups and had their own campaigns. It's no coincidence, I think, that there is quite a strong resemblance between these big four or big five, if you include others, macro categories of Nepal, and the big categories in terms of which people who work on North India think about politics and society there. So there's a slight difference in the terminology. So in India you have, they call forward castes, which is the sort of dominance. They talk about OBCs, which stands for other backward classes, which in a way is equivalent to Janajatis. The tribal, in North India, tribals are so few and far between they don't really count. But if you, and they have Muslims who are much more numerous in North India than they are in Nepal. Nepal, they come into the kind of small other category. And then they have SCs, which is, in other words, Dalits. But the blocks are quite similar, and there is a, so there is a you know, it's, as I say, it's not, they're both caste societies, and the distribution of caste is similar. And so you know, the fact that we've got similar, but not identical structures is not really surprising. One interesting difference, though, very fascinating difference between India and Nepal, is that in India, the terminology is evolutionists. Okay, it's in terms of time. So you talk about forward castes and backward castes. In Nepal, the language is spatializing. So instead of being in terms of time, it's in terms of space. So if you try and talk about the Nepalese context using Indian language, you get told off. You're not allowed to use terms like backward and forward. No, you've got to use excluded. And the Nepali term, simantikrit, actually means bordered or pushed to the border, excluded, physically excluded. Which of course is, if you remember the circle of concentric circles, look, the people right on the outside are actually physically at the borders, as well as being the most excluded groups. The fact that you have a rise of dominant ethnicity, both in India and in Nepal, shouldn't surprise us. I think in the last year, all of us, both in Europe and in North America, have woken up to the fact that white people have ethnicity too. We should have known that, but now it's been rammed down our throats by certain political events. E.P. Kaufman edited a book on ethnic cause, and I think back in 2004, he quite presciently wrote, global narratives of liberal multiculturalism, embedded in both global and national institutions, are driving an ever greater wedge between modern nations and their dominant ethnic groups. And if you think about the events of the last year, that seems quite prescient. Okay, this is just to give you some local colour. This is a song which you can look up on YouTube, Hami Nepali Teej, which means we Nepali. Teej is a big festival where women dance. There's a sort of celebration of women's fertility. And this particular song is an anti-caste song. Okay, it's one of these. It's got a very rhythmic kind of typical Nepali folk song. And this is, I mean, it's actually shot in a city, you can see, but it's meant to stand in for the kind of village meeting place. And what you can tell if you're Nepali, immediately you look at this and you see the sign which says Village Expulsion Program. Okay, Village Expulsion Program. And then the young man has untouchable around his neck. So what you can clearly see that what's happened is an untouchable, a Dalit young man has wanted to have married an upper caste girl, and they're being thrown out of the village for committing this sin. And the two singers come onto the stage and they start, what they sing is, we are all Nepali, that's all we know, there's no such thing as caste, I'm married to a Ban, I'm a Gurung, and my son is married to this and this and this, and they just, and it's incredible, for me anyway, it was incredible, it brings tears to your eyes, it's incredibly moving. Why is it incredibly moving? It's incredibly moving because it's so counter to reality. Everybody knows that caste does matter, and it matters enormously. So I just put that in just in case you want to look it up. All right, so now I'm going to move to some remarks about civil society and the third sector. So in 2006, the British government actually created an office of the third sector within its cabinet office, which was four years later was renamed the Office for Civil Society. Now clearly, this notion of three sectors of society is a model, it's an ideal type. But it's not just a model. It's a model which carries within it, or is a crucial means, technology, for advancing modernisation. As Lewis says, it's an ideal type. It's necessarily at odds with the present realities of actual life. Okay. But that doesn't mean to say it's just a model. It doesn't matter. It does matter very much. And what my thesis is that what activists are doing is they're negotiating that model. they're negotiating the gap between the model and the local reality, and they're also enacting the model and bringing it into that, that local reality. And the process that Latour called purification, that is to say the kind of working out of these modernist distinctions, of course, he invented that, he may have invented the term purification, but it's exactly the same process that Weberian sociologists call Societalization in English, or Vergesellschaftung in German. Different sectors with their own logics working their way out over time. I also think it's very important to hang on, and this is another vocabulary for talking about, partly about the same thing, is Gerd Bauman's distinction between the official, what he calls the official discourse, and the demotic discourse. And this is an important theoretical distinction that has evolved from his fieldwork in Southall, in West London. And it's not to say that the official discourse is fake and that the demotic discourse is real, absolutely not. Both are real, both are essential. Everybody who operates politics in Southall knows both has to be able to speak both discourses, and but the activists are the people who translate between them, convert one into the other. Now, as I hope my examples will show, there is a particular tension and attraction between the third sector of actors' mobilisation and politics. The same people go back and forth between parties, NGOs and movements, trying to maximise their impact, but always constrained by the fact that on the one hand, being close to political parties makes you suspect, both in the eyes of other activists and in the eyes of the general public. But on the other, if you want to actually get things done, you have to be close to power. You have to be close to political parties. Okay, so this is my example. This is my case study, Dr. Kirschenmann Sakya. Now Kirschenmann, that's how I first knew him, down at bottom right, 2003. In fact, I got to know him, for full disclosure, his younger brother was my PhD student at Brunel University in the late 1990s. And his younger brother is his oldest of 5 brothers, and he's I think number 4, was my PhD student, and he is now one of the leading Theravada monks in Thailand. But he wanted to do a PhD, he came to England to do a PhD, he did an MPhil in Cambridge, and then he came to me at Brunel, did a PhD under me. So through him I got to know Kirschenmann. And I went, in 2003, I went with, Kirschenmann at that time was working for GTZ, it's the German aid in Nepal. And he's a brilliant, brilliant aid worker. I mean, really, spending the day walking around the village of Gampokra with him was an inspirational and wonderful experience to see how fantastic he was at talking to people, motivating them. The young guy on the left is the young guy who actually had to live in the village and do the kind of day work, but he was checking up on him. But the way, he was just incredibly good at that. And he was the one who inspired me to actually start studying activism. Because what I realised was that although that was his kind of day job, and he was incredibly good at it, he had a PhD in forestry from America, and he'd worked for the government for a time, and then he'd started working for various different aid agencies. As I say, at the time he was working with GTZ. What his passion, though, was ethnic activism. So he would be going out all over the country with the GTZ Jeep, doing GTZ work, but in the evenings he was meeting Newar activists and constructing a national network of Newar activists to further his own activist aims. Some of the key experiences of his life, first of all, was part of his master's degrees, and that was under the old, before 1990, under the Panchayat system. In those days, when you did a master's degree, you had to spend a year out somewhere in a village doing development work. So that was his first experience of doing that, and that made a big impression on him. Then he had 2 periods of study, first at North Carolina State in 1980 to 1982, and then he did a doctorate in forestry at Virginia Tech, 1984 to 1987. And it's in the southern states of America where he experienced 4-H clubs, and also, crucially, he experienced Christian evangelical groups, and he started to see their techniques of working in proselytization. So when he came back to Nepal, he copied their techniques, and he set up a Young Men's Buddhist Association. Because he comes from the group, the Sakyas, whom I worked on for my PhD back in the early 80s, who think of themselves as descendants of the Buddha, and the core Buddhist Newas who are Buddhist through and through, unlike other Newas who are kind of half Hindu, half Buddhist. They feel themselves 100% Buddhist, and they feel they have a sort of duty to preserve Buddhism. So he started this Buddhist youth group, and they did 5 precept campaigns, Panchasila Abhiyan, in the villages around Kathmandu Valley, to try and basically convert people to modernist understanding of Buddhism. And then it occurred to them that what they really ought to be doing is spreading Buddhism beyond Mewat to these other Janajati groups, the Tamans and Gurungs, who had Tamans are strongly Buddhist, but in a very traditionalist Tibetan Buddhist way. Gurungs have a quasi-Buddhist identity, but it's not so clear. So they started campaigning, they started holding these camps, these training camps for a week, where they would try and train people up. And they started then, this was in the last days of the Panchayat regime, they started making contact with leaders of the Maghas, who they found were, the Maghas were looking to try and get out from under the Hindu umbrella and take up some other kind of religious identity, very much in the way that Ambedkar did for Dalits in India. So they started pushing Buddhist books towards them and encouraging them to become Buddhists. And then when the Panchayat regime fell in 1990, and there was the period when they were writing the new constitution, there was a massive, up till that time, that was the biggest demonstration that had ever been held in Kathmandu. That was on the 30th of June 1990, when a big march demanding that the new constitution be secular, that Hinduism not be given a special place in the constitution. That was the largest demonstration ever in Kathmandu up to that point. And Keshav Maan was one of the key organisers of that demonstration, which brought Buddhists and Christians and others together to demand a secular state. The Muslims were going to join in, but at the very last minute the Muslim leaders received a call from the palace and decided to pull out. So as I mentioned, his younger brother, Anil Sakya, or Bhikshu Suganda, became a Theravada monk back in 1974 and went to study in Bangkok, where he became the secretary to the Sangharaja, that's to say, the top monk in the whole of Thailand. So the Sangharaja has now just recently died. But this gave him a very powerful position in Thai Buddhism. And through him, they started a program of sending young boys from Nepal to Thailand to be trained as Buddhist monks. And in Thailand, as in Burma, but unlike in Sri Lanka, there is no shame to being a Buddhist monk and then disrobing. You can be a Buddhist monk in order to get an education. If then, when you finish that education, you decide to leave, that's fine. So the young boys in Nepal are told, quite explicitly told this, you can go to Thailand, which from the Nepali point of view is a very highly developed, advanced country. You can get an education for free. There's no obligation to remain a monk once you've finished your education. So quite a few Janajati boys from different groups have gone under this program. So that was also part of Keshav Maan's Buddhist activism. His Buddhist activism may be said to have come to full fruition when the coalition government of 2007 to 8 made him the deputy chairman of the Lumbini Development Trust. Lumbini, of course, is the place where the Buddha was born. It's a key pilgrimage site and a key place for, also a very contentious place for development. He resigned from the position after just 20 months of his 5-year intended tenure, and the reason was, he wanted to set up his own political party at that point, and the Minister of Culture, who was a Maoist, this was a coalition government led by the Maoists, wanted him to join the Maoist party. He said, no, I'm sorry, I don't want to join the Maoists, rather please relieve me of my post. And so he left off being as I say, the kind of key person, because the deputy chairman of the Lumbini Development is actually the chief executive, because the chairman is the Minister of Culture. So that's his NGO work and his Buddhist activism. But as I say, he founded his own ethnic party, the Nepal Rashtriya Party, because the election of 2008 was about to come. And he seized the moment. Unlike many Newa ethnic activists who were too scared or hoped that the Maoists would somehow give them a post, he seized the moment. he set up a national party, Nepal Rashtriya Party there, as you can see, with a symbol of the medieval sword, the Tarwar. And he was the intellectual brains of the organising powerhouse behind it. And this ethnic activism went right back to 1990, where he'd been in 1990 and 1991. He'd been one of the key movers in setting up the Nepal Federation of Nationalities, which later became the Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities. That is the key federal body that brings together all the different ethnic groups. So although he wasn't one of the best known figures, behind the scenes he was one of the most important organisers. So as this 2008 election was approaching, and we had this new system where 60% proportional, it meant that you didn't have to get a lot, everybody was going to have 2 votes, 1 vote for the first past the post, and the second vote for the proportional system, which led to a brilliant cartoon in the Nepali Times, where somebody is standing next to the two ballots, one's blue and one's pink, and their head is in a complete spin, and it says, cast your vote or vote your cast. So because obviously the proportional, if many people understood, and they understood it even better the second time round in 2013, you didn't have to vote for the same party on both ballot papers. You could vote for one of the big parties, the Nepali Congress or the UML, on the first past the post, but you could vote for a kind of small ethnic party, or as it happened in 2013 for the big, the kind of quote-unquote reactionary pro-Hindu party on the proportional. So he seized that moment, he set up this party, they got about 30,000 votes, I think, anyway, they got enough votes to get 1 MP. He didn't go for the MP, they sent somebody else to be their MP, but he remained the brains behind the party. And eventually, with the passing of time, the second Maoist government came in. He eventually became a minister. It wouldn't be possible now with the new constitution, but at that time it was possible to become a minister even though he wasn't an MP. So for about 9 months from May 2012, he became 10 months till March 2013. He was Minister of Environment, Science and Technology, which he himself said to me, "Oh, this is amazing. only in Nepal could this happen, that somebody with such a small party could become a minister." He attended 9 international conferences on climate change, which of course is a very key issue for Nepal with all the melting glaciers and so on. In South Korea at the Green Energy Summit, he was a speaker alongside Jeffrey Sachs, and he's tried to start various initiatives to address Nepal's chronic energy deficit, and set up a nuclear technology centre, a space technology centre, a biotechnology department, and so on, as well as pushing hard for alternative energy and so on. And after the earthquake, the Thai, through his younger brother, the Thai links were mobilised to try and bring in as much aid. So of course, you get masses of blankets sent in from Bangkok and food and other stuff. You take it up to some village, and of course you have to have a photo opportunity, and you've got to have a photo has to be put on Facebook to prove that you've done it, and so on. So I've concentrated very much on ethnic identities here, but those are not the only kinds of new identities that have emerged in modern Nepal. There are many others. I mean, after the earthquake, one of the new identities which emerged very clearly was that of youth activists. The government was so slow and so pathetic in the initial 2 or 3 months after the earthquake. Lots of middle-class youth activists started just gathering stuff together, putting it in trucks and heading for the hills themselves. And they all decided there was a massive computer, which they used their tech skills to try and make sure they didn't duplicate their, Facebook didn't just become a kind of suddenly in those 3 months after the earthquake. It wasn't just a kind of daily kind of seminar. It was also an activist. That you put a call out on Facebook, we need this and this and this, or we have a truck going, anybody want to join us? And it was amazing, and it was dynamic, and it was a new kind of identity which was gradually ground down and squeezed out as the government reasserted control. But there are many other kinds of person. Conflict afflicted. Somebody conflict afflicted person is There are groups, and Ruth Marsden has written a whole thesis about how people learn to speak the language of post-conflict and post-peace, post-conflict and peacetime, reconstruction and human rights, and how ordinary people, Tarus from the Terai, learned how to speak that language. Even the Maoists themselves have adopted the language of individual human rights, both when demonstrating in the early days and saying resistance is a human right, and then later when making claims on the state for compensation packages after they've been in cantonments overseen by the UN. Perhaps the most dramatic case is one I've mentioned already, the third gender. For a long time I was puzzled, but when my Nepali friends started referring to gay people as being the preferred gender, and I thought, what's going on here? Are they confused? Do they not know the difference between sexuality and gender? What's going on? Why are they saying Tesorolingi, third gender for gay people? But no, I think what happened was that thanks to public interest litigation brought by the Blue Diamond Society, the Nepali courts and Nepali law adopted the Yogyakarta Principles of 2007, and the key person in the Blue Diamond Society himself was present in Yogyakarta when those principles were drawn up, and the Nepali courts adopted them. They put in a public interest litigation, and the courts adopted them, and that's then been taken into the constitution. So there is now an identity, a third gender identity, which includes all LGBTI people. It's a kind of umbrella term, third gender, to include all alternative forms or non-heteronormative or non-hetero forms that come under this one new kind of identity, which in a sense, if you like, has been modelled on the importance of ethnic identities in Nepal. Okay, so this is my final slide, final thought. Bruno Latour famously declared there are 4 things wrong with actor-network theory. The words actor, network, theory, and the hyphen. And following Mike Lynch, he wrote, it should in fact be called actant rhizome ontology. In Latour's understanding of a theory, it's a non-theory. It's a solvent. It dissolves all existing theory and puts nothing in its place. Just like Madhyamika philosophy in Buddhism dissolves all our philosophical illusions, and pulls up the ladder behind. There's nothing behind. There is nothing in its place. Or maybe the better, in Latour's case, maybe the right parallel would be General de Gaulle's political party that was not a political party. But reviewing the long history of the emergence of ethnic identities in Nepal, modern ethnic identities, I don't see, as Latour would, a parliament of things or objects with agency. What I rather see is human beings acting together, collectively bringing into existence new forms of life. Particular technical advances, of course, help. It's arguable that the internet may give, obviously the internet is absolutely crucial for many, many things, but it also may give activists the illusion of agency rather than its substance, since they may have the impression they're communicating with large numbers of people when in fact all we're doing is passing messages around a small group of like-minded people. There are indeed 3 political technologies, 2 older and 1 more recent, which have driven this process of ethnicity formation. The old technologies are the census and adult suffrage. The more recent one is PILs, or public interest litigation. So those 2 older technologies have taken 30 or 50 years to work through the various consequences. Before 1990, the regime deliberately did not collect, or if it did collect, did not publish ethnic statistics. And of course, the decision in 1990 to publish those had important political consequences. And one contrasts India, where their census only collects or only publishes data on its scheduled castes, that's to say, Dalits, and scheduled tribes, but it doesn't publish caste statistics on other castes. The consequences of these technologies did not happen because of the data, they happened because certain activists believed they mattered and they fought to make them relevant. So in this sense, and from this point of view, I've sympathised with James Laidlaw's critique of actor-network theory as providing a dehumanised vision of the world that voids it of moral and evaluative content. I do not believe that focusing on material processes to the exclusion of uniquely human agency and human propensity to evaluation is the royal road to understanding anything. But on the other hand, what is true is that the world of the activist is full of what ANT calls hybrids. Now, this term hybrid has a very specific meaning in this context that may not be obvious to those who are not familiar with STS speak or Anthro speak. Now, hybrids here refers, to actants, that's to say anything that has an effect, anything that constrains action. Note that can be contexts, individuals, processes. And why do we call them hybrid? Because they do not respect the formal boundaries of the modernist constitution. In other words, they mix, for example, religion and politics, or sport and economics, or social service and politics, and so on. So an obvious case of purification, that's to say the attempted separation and avoidance of hybridity, is the pretense of political non-alignment. So that, when NGOs say, oh no, we're not political, that is forced on them by the logic of the third sector. And it's forced on them by the funding agencies in the Nepali case, by INGOs who insist we don't fund political organizations. But of course, in practice, everybody knows, in the backstage context, that so supposedly non-political nature is and often has to be breached. NEFIN, the Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities, had very valuable development funding from DFID, British Aid Agency. But it lost that funding when it decided to hold the Nepal Bandh, that's to say a general strike, to close down the whole of the Kathmandu Valley for a day in 2007. A commonly heard metaphor in Nepal is that you can be a member of the organization, you can have political opinions, you can be a member of a party, but it's like the holy shrine of Pashupati. When you enter the shrine, you leave your shoes at the door when you go in. In other words, the dirty shoes are the dirty politics, you leave them behind when you enter the organization. You can be a member, but you cannot be a member of the organization as a political activist. And in fact, some organizations actually have a rule that people who are very active or senior in political parties cannot be part of the executive committee or whatever. They can be a member but not part of the committee, precisely in order to prevent that politicisation. But it is a fact of life. Everybody knows that most NGOs or most associations have some kind of alignment, or most individuals. It's usually public knowledge, not written down anywhere, but that so-and-so is affiliated with such and such a party. And it's a fact of life also that nowadays, that for example, if you're in the university and you want promotion, if you have no links to any political party, you won't get it. Those promotions are handed out by what's known as the Bhag Banda, or division of spoils system, so the parties. If you don't have any affiliation to one of the three big parties, the Maoists, the Congress and the UML, you won't get it. So, in short, and to be absolutely clear for those interested in such questions, with apologies to those who are not, I reject the flattening effect of ANT, its destruction of the non-human-human dichotomy, its lack of interest in human agency. But I accept the advances it has made in bringing things back into social theory, and I'm willing to use its vocabulary to describe the constitution of modernity, i.e. the set of distinctions that activists have attempted to embody and introduce in Nepal. ANT is one possible vocabulary among others, one that is increasingly widely understood. Ian Hacking's conceptualization of making up people is another highly suggestive and perhaps less misleading way to talk these matters, as I hope what I've said above demonstrates. At the everyday, demotic or unofficial level, the formal distinctions of modernity, the separation of different spheres, the political, the economic, the religious and so on, are and must be breached. And holding on to both ends of that dichotomy is essential, both for us as students of the phenomenon and for those practitioners who actually live that tension. That's what activists do. The skillful ones are those who build up and mobilize large networks. They are masters of hybridity. The less skillful remains confined to small circles of like-minded people, both geographically and increasingly on the internet. So the skillful ones create this new world, have created the new world the Nepalis live in. Be the change yourself. That is a kind of, it's not for nothing, a well-known activist slogan. Activists perform the distinctions they create, and they are, to adapt one of Raoul's informants, I would say they're the plumbers of modernity, as opposed to the plumbers of democracy. Another way of putting it, of course, is to say that they are boundary hoppers, or translators, or mediators, and of course sometimes equally gatekeepers and boundary maintainers. Of course, there's nothing specific. Living with hybridity is not specifically activist. Okay? We all live with hybridity in this very specific sense. But to be an activist is to set out to mould other people's ways of being and other people's ways of doing in one sphere by using principles derived from another sphere. And it's not only that activists mediate global norms and local realities, translating modernity into the vernacular and back again, as has been stressed by many observers of activists and their movements. It's that the activists introduce the very distinctions of modernity itself and then translate from one modern sphere to the other, e.g. from law into politics. So if you're wondering why is he bothered with all this ANT stuff, does he really need it? My answer is, well, I think the ANT stuff helps us talk about modernity. It's the whole package of modernity and tensions within it. So it's not just a question of vernacularization. So these various forms of translation are one reason why the famous dichotomy between civil society and political society set up by Partha Chatterjee is too rigid, too dichotomizing, and ultimately misleading. I hope the examples I have given, even very briefly, show that there is a vibrant civil society, not just political mobilization, in the vernacular too. Activists set out to mould society in line with one or other modernizing framework, in line with one or other set of official classifications. But of course, they often end up being moulded themselves in the process.
Maybe I could just start with a question which sort of, before then opening the floor to everybody else, which was really like sort of coming back to your point about the relationship between certain sets of actors you're discussing, like these ethnic activists on the one hand, and different types of categorizations and the relation between the two. So if I understand correctly, I mean these ethnic activists are actually sort of fighting for recognition of certain classifications of political participation for influence within their whole. I'm just wondering at the same time, what about this hierarchy of belonging? How does that play into the whole thing? I mean, you were making this distinction between the official discourse and the emotic discourse. And it's very clear, sort of, I mean, that the ethnic activists are more on the demotic side. At the same time, I'm just wondering whether these kind of contestations around, I mean, acceptance as an ethnic group, whatever, whether that also relates to the question of the hierarchy. You know that certain people don't want to be at the fringe of what you know, sort of at the borderlands. Where there's a reshifting of the hierarchy as well.
Well, what they're fighting for, I mean, depends. If you take the ones who are right on the outer rim of the hierarchy of belonging, I mean, the Bhotias, the Tibetans, they're so few in number, they can't fight for anything. But the Madhishis are large in number, and not only are they large in number, they are strategically placed, geostrategically placed. So if they block the roads, Kathmandu starves. And so you better take them seriously. And they feel, you know, the laws may say that they're equal, but the actual practices of the state are extremely unequal. And there are various provisions in the new constitution which they say amount to structural violence and structural inequality. So although formally speaking, under the law, they're equal, both the actual practice of government offices and the provisions of the constitution are discriminatory on this end. And they've got a long list. They've got a list of about 17 or 20 things in ways in which the constitution in practice discriminates against them. But there are also various misunderstandings about the constitution, such as, for example, that anybody born to a mother who was herself born in India will not have full Nepali citizenship, which is not correct, but it's widely believed by Madhishis. So there's a kind of problem of the state hasn't made its. The state has also shot itself in the foot in many ways.
Thank you very much for a great talk. I work both in Central Asia and in Myanmar, and what you said resonated a lot with what I know from both of my field sites. And the comment I have is I really like what you said about nation building and ethnicity building and how the two are interrelated. Actually, I would constate that probably you can track down from the north to the south and from the past to the present the traveling of models about nation building and ethnicity building. So a lot of what you said concerning Nepal is what the Soviets did for the whole of the Soviet Union, and what I know from contemporary Kyrgyzstan, and what is now coming to Myanmar. And this relates to the question I have. I really like the concept of the activist as a master of hybridity, and I think you mentioned another activist without calling him such, which is Jeffrey Sachs. So there's a cast of activists who are engaged in the business of hybridity, basically, who were active post-1990 in the former Soviet Union and who also travel south, apparently to Nepal as well, and now also to Myanmar. And they are the ones basically creating the floor that make these discourses possible as well. So there's a different kind of activism which is very much connected to economic transformation, political transformation, which I think would be worthwhile looking at as well. And the question I had concerning ethnic activism, what you said about your informant to me sounded like missionary activity. So is missionary activity a form of ethnic activism? I mean, if he goes on converting people to Buddhism in the evenings, isn't that a classical form of missionary activity? Why don't you call it ethnic activism?
Well, you're right. It doesn't fall under, if you accept the modern constitution in modern terms, of course, the people they're targeting with these week-long Buddhist camps are people who are supposedly already Buddhist. So what they're doing is a bit like, Tablighi Jamaat within Islam. They're teaching people how to be a good Buddhist, right? So they're targeting groups who suppose, in fact, in practice they're not, but they're groups who claim to be Buddhist already. And so it doesn't fall, although it's true, in India there is a law against proselytization. It doesn't count as proselytization because it's not going across the boundaries of what modernity defines as religion. So, as in Europe, you have a census, you have a choice. What is your religion? You're only allowed to tick one box. So, there is this kind of binary thinking about religions. When the old joke is that a foreigner goes to Kathmandu and he says to a Newar, are you a Buddhist or a Hindu? And the Newar says yes. So the foreigner writes down in a notebook, this Newar is deeply confused. But actually no, it's the foreigner who's confused. The foreigner has misused the word "or" and misunderstood the logic of the situation. The Newar is absolutely right to say yes in most cases. I don't know if that answers your question.
What about the first one?
About economic activists.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I guess that is a kind of. You're right. There are all these different types of activists creating new types of people that I mentioned. I hadn't thought of, but you're right. The kind of World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, when they are trying to get people, it's. Anthropologists tend to throw the word neoliberalism around a lot, and the neoliberal person, without being very precise about it, but it's true, they are trying to get people to behave in this kind of market entrepreneurial way.
And it's interlinked. I mean, your informant is a GIZ.
That is what they're doing. When he was exactly these savings groups on just precisely GTZ is trying to spread this kind of resilience and local savings groups as a kind of way of helping women to go and make some money and take responsibility for their fate. Yeah.
Rob.
In one of your articles, I remember that you made a distinction. It was like and you wrote it with somebody to try to do a classification of all the different types of activism in Nepal. And I remember that in the introduction you made a distinction between religious activism and the activism that was stemming from secular post-enlightenment principles. And I wonder if your use of ANT language is trying to bridge between the two understandings in more of a rhizomatic way, because it's happening parallel and like in between. I mean, it's part of the hybrid process of combining religion with all these different processes of what is happening. Is it a necessary language for all the different non-linear ways of hierarchy that are taking place?
Is the ANT language
Yes.
necessary to try and bridge the kind of gap between those?
Or do you stick to what you said in that article?
I don't remember exactly what I said. You remember it better than me. But I would, you know, I think what's going on, I mean, yeah, is the reason one has to make those distinctions between kind of religious activists and ethnic activists is because they're starting to work with these kind of constitutional modality. And so, you know, you can have the same person, you can have somebody like Keshav Man who wants to push the Buddhist thing, he wants to push the ethnic thing, but the concepts of modernity force them to do it separately, they can't do it together. So they have to set up one organisation for the ethnic issue and a different organisation for the religious, because in modern ways of thinking, these things are not the same. And you find the same, and that's not, you know, it doesn't just happen there, you know, it happens even more in the diaspora, that you just can't combine these things. You have to, you have to be able to answer the question, is this primarily a religious organisation or is it primarily an ethnic organisation? So, I would say, I would see the ANT thing as just another, maybe a more encompassing way of talking about the same thing.
Chairman Hyde.
Hi David, thanks for your presentation and your talk. I guess I'm interested in the figure of the activist, and since you've traced so nicely the history of the place where you did fieldwork throughout so many years, I was just wondering, all of a sudden these activists appear empirically, and that's interesting and it's fascinating. I was just wondering whether you also thought about where's the origins of this kind of masters of hybrid, or this master of hybridity. Like, where does it pop up in the first place? Like, when does the need for such a person, such a broker, appear, or what is the sources of inspirations that they draw from to model themselves as activists, right? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Who are they modelling themselves on? Well, I mean, it starts in the 1930s, and in the 1930s it's a high stakes game, a very high stakes game. So you can get killed, you know, the regime. You know, some people did get, you know, for starting some tiny political organisation. They were hung to death. And the one conspirator who was a Brahmin, because the Brahmins were true believing Hindus of the old sort, and true old Hinduism, it's a sin to kill a Brahmin. So he survived. He wasn't hung. He was just uncasted and had his property taken away. But so they were inspired by the Russian Revolution. They were inspired by Gandhi and what was happening in India. A lot of the early political activists were actually they were actually part of the Indian Congress movement, Indian freedom movement, and then brought that same thing back. So, and then the Communist Party of Nepal was founded in Calcutta in 1949. So yeah, they were taking there was the leftist, there was the kind of socialist, there was the leftist. So, they were reading, the early ones, you know, were reading George Bernard Shaw. Then the leftist one of the things I discovered when I did my activist project was that they were, you know, they were reading a lot of leftist novels from Russia. What's his name? Mother. Gorky. Yeah. It was very, you know, it's a very powerful novel about it sort of has a kind of universal symbolic appeal, because the symbol of the mother translates very, very well, especially, I guess, probably all over the world, but certainly to all Asian cultures. So a lot of people found that very moving, even the ones who are not explicitly communists. And then what happened was, in the Panchayat regime, when the Panchayat was an authoritarian, non-political parties were suppressed, But the great irony is that the Chinese and the Russians were pumping propaganda into Nepal. Seemed to be having no effect whatsoever. The Russian bookshop and the Chinese bookshop were more or less giving stuff away free. You could buy English translations. And there used to be this glossy magazine called China Pictorial, which was translated into Nepali. And it had these glossy pictures of tractors and development. And this actually had a lot of Janajati people were very impressed by it, because the Chinese, they look like Chinese, so they would say, oh, it's people like us in charge and doing development. So that had, and so that the long-term seeds of the Maoist movement in Nepal were actually sown during that Panchayat period. You didn't see that. It wasn't very much on the surface, but that's where a lot of influences were coming from that. So that's the great paradox is, at the time when China was genuinely interested in exporting Maoism to Nepal, nothing happened. When China became only interested in making money and basically having getting rich, that's when Maoism succeeded in Nepal. So there was a temporal displacement for that.
Marina.
Thank you for your presentation. Just maybe a comment. I think it was interesting when you answered the question of the distinction between religious activism and ethnic activism, and sort of mentioned how the strength of the ideals of modernity modulate the distinction. In the West African context where I work, there's not that kind of relevance to these borders created by the ideals of modernity. So I think one question we could ask ourselves around the issue of activism is how, when it's modulated through the ideals of modernity, how in different local places these ideals have or do not have a significance. But that's just a comment. However, I have a question regarding if, on one hand, the question of you mentioned the sort of interfeeding of ethnic identity construction and nation building construction, and then on the other end, the sort of blurring of civil society and state spaces. I'm wondering, in light of these two elements, how would you see the relationship between activism and lobbyism? Lobbying. Or do you think it's not relevant, or is it relevant?
No, of course not. I mean, many activists do lobby.
Yeah, and how should we think about these two?
I mean, the way I think about it is that activists are involved in a contest of values, and they're always trying to be holier than thou on some level of values or not. So I didn't have time to go into it, but a lot of NGOs in Nepal are actually affiliated to particular political parties. So some are not. Or some try not very hard not to be, but a lot of them were originally. So a lot of human rights organisations were set up by people coming out of the UNL, for example. And all the political parties have their own fronts. So each political party will have a Dalit front, and they'll have a Janajati front, and so on. So, and a women's front, and so on. So there are a lot of activists out there who are quite explicitly aligned with particular political parties, and then there are others who try to bridge that and try to say, no, we're not subject to political parties doing independent. So there's always this question: which way is going to have the more influence? Which way is actually going to? Because obviously, if your political party is in power, then maybe actually the people who are explicitly linked to a party will have more say, or maybe not. And one of the things that the party managers tried very hard to do was to stop there being a Janajati caucus, and so where all the different Janajati fronts of the different parties would come together and push for Janajati things together within Parliament. And they tried to ban that in the Second Constituent Assembly. On your first point about the religious versus ethnic, I mean, the two things do blur, obviously. The distinction between being religious and being ethnic is there, and yet one of the fascinating things, which I haven't been able fully to nail, is that in 1991, there's a kind of macro group, ethnic group, which is sort of macro category that combines the Rai, Limbu, Sunua, and various other ethnic groups in the east of the country. They managed to get their religious traditions established under the religion question in the census. So it's as if Other ethnic groups haven't followed that suit, but you know, I don't know why. I'm not quite sure why not. But they managed to get Kiranti religion established, so it's really an ethnic religion. So it just means anything that Kirantis do, and that covers a whole variety of things. So then you know, these two categories, the categories do get blurred in certain contexts. They don't always. You know, the Purata purification doesn't work sometimes.
Right.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm fascinated by your sort of final statement, activists as masters of hybridity, while on the other hand you start with Ian Hacking's notion of multiple personality syndromes, which of course then leads to the question, is being an activist actually a disease? You know, are they suffering from a kind of multiple personality syndrome in that they need to juggle various identities at the same time, which of course may mark them out as people indeed of a special social category that, for instance, in the African context you would qualify as being, for instance, a medium. A medium can juggle different realities and different personalities at the same time. He is indeed suffering from a multiple personality syndrome in that regard. So is activism actually a kind of a social disease that rather is something that you would want to avoid in some respect? And the other question would be, what kind of hybridity are we really talking about here? Is this really an hybridity? I'm a bit doubtful there, because one thing might be the case that there is no way in which ethnic identifications can become hybridized. You cannot juggle and blur different ethnic categorizations, ethnic identifications, or can they? That would even make the disease even more serious in that regard. If they can really jump from one ethnic identity into the other. But I'm not entirely sure whether hybridity in the multiple personality syndrome can be pushed into that direction in the Nepalese case.
Wow, what a lot of questions.
Sorry.
Yeah, but good one, all good ones. You know, is it a disease? Well, look, you know, it's well known on Saturday, which is the kind of day for meetings in Nepal, you know, a lot of these activists, precisely they are, I don't know about multiple identity, I mean multiple personality syndrome, but they certainly have multiple identities. They're usually running to about half a dozen different meetings across town, you know, on every Saturday. If you want to, you can never meet them on a Saturday because you have to run after them to go to each of these different meetings. And they often, you know, the very active ones do indeed have, you know, they're the chair of half a dozen different organizations at once. So it is these very extrovert, very energetic kind of people who manage to kind of put on something that everybody can do. And maybe other people do regard it as a kind of affliction of some kind. Yeah. Maybe their wives particularly regard it as a kind of affliction. Because they spend so much money on it and for such little reward. What kind of hybridity are we talking about? So yes, I mean, it's not the conventional kind of hybridity. So before I started talking to this, so before I sort of swallowed all these books by Latour, I actually, you know, a long time ago, I gave a talk in Kathmandu about hybridity, which was meant in the more conventional sense, that it was against the idea that there are these pure, against trying to just remind the Nepalis themselves that ethnic identities are not simple and given in the nature of things, and that people, they do shift around quite a lot, and all kinds of people have intermarried and changed their identities over time. And so I just wanted to remind people of that. To kind of make it a bit more lively, I said, this was kind of, when was it? It was, I think it was a conference in 2003. And I said in the conference presentation, I said, and we should start at the top. And the king, this is before, Nepal was still a monarchy, King Gyanendra should change his name, Gyanendra Veer Mugger Dev. In other words, he should acknowledge the fact, which is sort of it's a kind of public secret, that the royal family at the time, you just look at their face, you can tell they've got some Mongoloid blood in them. I mean, they're not pure Aryans from the south as they claim to be. They're definitely, the royal family and the Muggers. There's a whole history there. The most famous temple of Mankamana has mother priests, and the Gorkha temple, you know, there's all these kind of links with the mothers. So it's very clear that the mother Chetri boundary line is not, you know, certainly mother families have transitioned into becoming Chetris when they became high status or generals in the army or whatever. So it's very clear that's a blurred boundary line. And, you know, I basically said, why don't we acknowledge this from the top, that, you know, ethnic groups are actually mixed. And I took myself to be attacking high caste pretensions to caste purity. I thought, you know, I was being very daring and so on. And it had in one sense, it had the effect that I predicted, in the sense that it was reported on the front page of the Himalayan Times the next day. And the report, surprisingly for Nepal, was 98% accurate. And unfortunately, the journalist inserted one sentence which was not accurate, which is something I never said, which was, you know, ethnic identities are hybrid, therefore the Janajatis don't need to organise. Okay, which I never said that. I never said that follows. It doesn't follow, and I don't believe that it follows, but I never said it. So what happened then was quite interesting. There was a whole series of letters. To my surprise, the high caste people supported me and said, yes, he's right. The Janajati people said, no. You know, they took this because they, of course, for them, strategic essentialism is really important. We need to organise. They saw this as an attack on their ability to mobilise their base and fight for Janajati rights. You know, if we're all hybrid, then why, you know, so that was me, you know, and that if I'm known for anything among the kind of wider, you know, non-academic kind of public sphere in Nepal, that one being event, one appearance on the front pages of that, you know, when I meet politicians, they say, oh yeah, you're that guy, aren't you, who said we're all hybrid, aren't you? So I'm now talking about a totally different kind of hybridity, which is not this kind of hybridity at all. What I'm talking about is Latour's hybridity, which is to say that simply the claim that these distinct spheres of religion, politics, social service, sport, law, really exist, you know, separate from each other. That's all I'm claiming.
Yeah.
But maybe the two things are connected, in a way which I haven't perceived it.
Well, that is very possible.
But on the question of ethnic categorization, whether people can jump from one to the other. Now, obviously, it's not the case that you can, if you're a mother, that you can just suddenly start announcing that you're not a mother. In fact, you can't do that. And if you're a Dalit, well, some Dalits can pass, and do pass in certain circumstances. But when it comes time to get married, then people are going to make some pretty elaborate investigation to make sure that, you know, if you claim to be a Chetri, that you really are a Chetri, it's going to be hard to get away with it. So it is, in certain circumstances it's possible to pass, and in others it's not. So but you can't just, it's not something you can pull off the peg and just say, oh, you know, tomorrow I'm going to be a Guru. It doesn't work like that. But having said that, there are lots of people who have intermarried. There are lots of, in particular among the Sherpas, there are certain, you know, Newar family moved up there, and then after a couple of generations, they're now their Sherpas, you know. So I mean, we can find lots of individual family cases like this where people in the past have switched what are supposed to be hermetically sealed categories. And now, of course, now there's lots and lots of intermarriage. You know, one of my old friends, even some years back, said to me, you know, David, now. If your child doesn't have an intercaste marriage, you start to wonder if there's something wrong with them. It's so fashionable.
Thank you very much. I think I can start. Just to make an announcement, for those of you who are interested in joining the workshop, it's tomorrow at 8:30.